speakers for this evening. So the first person who's going to talk to us tonight is Tommy Hefferman. Tommy is a vet from Ireland. He's known as the Irish vet. He's originally from County Kerry, right down in the far west of Ireland. Was moved to the softer, more gentle parts of the west, of the east of Ireland, to Wicklow. He graduated from UCD in Dublin in 2002 in veterinary science. Spent 15 years in practice. Was a Nuffield scholar about 2 years ago, looking at housing dairy cows and how to get the best productivity out of dairy cows and being very cow-centered in that approach. And now he works, runs his own business, providing advice on how to get the best housing, the best cow-centered decisions around beef units and dairy units across both Ireland and the UK. So any second now, Tommy's going to come on and he'll be presenting our first talk of the evening.
Thank you, John. Good evening to everybody. And thank you very much for the opportunity this evening to join you. We're going to talk about focus on comfort and roughage. And I suppose I'm going to talk about the comfort piece. And like John said, if there's any questions that you might have along the way, please feel free to ask. As you've gathered by my accent and John's very kind introduction, I'm across the Irish Sea, just south of Dublin here in County Wicklow, where I was in general practice for about 15 and a half years, where I developed a huge interest in herd-based medicine. We had a mixed practice, but I spent a lot of my time working with cattle, sheep, and a lot with dairy cows. So over the last 3.5 years, I've been working as a veterinary consultant, both in Ireland and the UK, doing a lot of training work, and I was lucky in that time as well to do a bit of travel globally. And I'm back on farm a lot for the last couple of months, but you know, I'm conscious when you're on webinars or you're giving talks or doing training. It's easy to talk about animal health when your calving jack is a laptop. I play on the words of Eisenhower, who said it's easy to talk about farming when your plough is a pen. So I'll try and keep it as practical as I can tonight. Just to give you a bit of an insight into maybe some of my thinking around, I have a huge interest in obviously working inside the farm gate, but I'm keeping an eye as well on factors that are challenges outside the farm gate. So as a young vet, obviously I was very conscious of treating those sick animals at herd level, but I quickly realised that the preventative or herd-based approach was where we could get real results, and that's where I really got interested in herd-based medicine. And I realised that how we fed our animals had a massive impact on their health. And I would even say my interest has gone right back to soil now and how we're growing our forages and crops for our animals. Just before we came on there, we were having a discussion about the quality of protein we produce in our farms, in the UK and Ireland, and the role that protein has in human health. And I think it's a really good story that we need to continue talking about in farming. Inside the farm gate, I'm very interested in immunity of animals, how we can improve and increase immunity. I think a really interesting area as well is this whole area of microbiome and gut health. I was very lucky to complete a Nuffield scholarship 2 years ago, where I went back to basics, and I spend a lot of my time talking about basics now, but understanding of the biology of animals in our farming systems and how we optimize that and get better performance, and balancing all these things. Of course, there's a huge conversation around farming the environment, and I think it's really important. And I think most farmers would agree that this is the time of year for the evening meeting, the pint and a pie, as you say over there. But COVID-19 has changed a lot, but it's also going to probably accelerate some trends around antibiotic usage on farm, and some there'll be changes there. So there's lots of challenges out there, but I think there's lots of opportunities. I'm involved in a 5-year project. We're just starting at the moment, looking at some of these areas: people training, nutrition and production on our farms, welfare and animal health, and a big focus on soil, environment and biodiversity. But we do believe on our farms that we're producing a human health food. What's really important to me is farmer sustainability, because all of these, we can use a lot of buzzwords when we talk about a lot of these topics, but it's so important to have primary producers that are profitable. So hopefully tonight, some of my tips, albeit they might be simple, might be of benefit, maybe get you thinking about maybe the housing and the comfort side for the winter. So I talk about a cow-centered approach, and again, it's just understanding, what does the cow want herself, and if we can look after her, she'll look after us. So some of my top tips, I'm going to talk about 10 areas of focus, and they're going to be quite simple. A lot of it will be around housing and this idea of comfort. I'm a master cow signals trainer. I got really interested in the whole cow signals piece about 6 years ago, and it transformed me as a vet on how I thought about animals. And I wasn't looking at things properly. I was tending to get into very detailed discussions around really heavy topics and disease, when sometimes some of the challenges were quite obvious. I'm going to talk a little bit about parasites and disease as well, because housing time affords us the opportunity to really look at parasite control in our farms. So let's start with a very simple one, water. It's the building block for health. But how much time do we spend looking at water? And I suppose the important thing to understand about water in our ruminant animals, and any animals, water down to the cell biology level plays a critical role with electrolytes and cell function. It's one of the key nutrients. But our ruminants also have an extra requirement, because we don't feed our cattle. We feed the billions of bugs inside that large rumen or stomach, and that's a fermentation bat. And any bat requires water. So water intakes, particularly for all cattle, but particularly where we're pushing cattle on and looking for growth rates, we just need to look at water. So just in your farms this winter, what do you need to think about when it comes to water? Well, we've got to understand, I suppose, how the cow drinks. She uses her tongue to lap that water up. So an adequate sized drinking bowl or trough is important. We must remember, you know, if we've different sized animals inside in the pen, that we actually have the water at the right height. Just like ourselves, they like fresh, clean water. So can we clean out those troughs? And just especially when we've more numbers in sheds, making sure that there's space around those water troughs. And particularly very important if we've cows and heifers maybe coming up to calving, that those heifers can get in for water as well. And water, just one flip side of water is, just make sure when you see those leaking water troughs that we take action with them, because too much water in our sheds, as I'll talk about in point number 4, I think, can lead to moisture. But it's a really simple starting point. I'll always go on to farm and I look at water as my first point. The next thing I'll talk about is I look at space. And we're all learning about COVID-19, unfortunately, that, you know, we're seeing increased spread when people are going into congregated areas with poor ventilation, and that's how disease spreads. So we need to think about social distancing from a cattle perspective in the spread of disease. When you look at space and in winter accommodation, it's really important. And it comes back a lot to cattle comfort. Cattle are gregarious species, so they'll spend a lot of time lying down together, they'll spend a lot of time standing or feeding, and that lying time is really important because that's when they ruminate or chew the cud, so it's a very important time for them. So having adequate space is really, really important. Now, space costs money, and I'm not paying for new constructions, but we just need to think about space as a long-term investment, particularly when we're looking for thrive off cattle. It's just something I think is really important. Another factor sometimes we don't think about is when we put in our weanlings or younger stock at the start of a winter, or maybe if it's a long winter and we're looking for good growth rates, that those animals are going to grow. So are we allowing for maybe in February, when those cattle are still housed, space allowance? And, you know, it's not about building new buildings all the time. You know, I'm constantly faced with the challenges of maybe bad springs where we would be letting calves and cows out after calving time, and, you know, weather is not allowing it. And we just have to be a little bit inventive around areas that we might find on a farm that takes pressure off. Because if we have a lot of animals heavily stocked in sheds, we've got to look for solutions to try and take that pressure off. So it's not about building new sheds, it's a long-term investment, but just being a little bit innovative around how we think. The third point, and this is a really important one for me, is fresh air. Fresh air does two important things. Fresh air, first of all, has a thing called ozone in it. So it's nature's natural disinfectant. That ozone will kill bacteria and pathogens in it. And, you know, adequate fresh air, particularly during housing, is really, really important to keep down that infection pressure of these bugs and viruses. The second thing fresh air does, and my granny used to say it, about a good day for drying the clothes on the line. You know, fresh air really does a good job in drying out our sheds and reducing down moisture. So fresh air plays two key roles. And I think we all have a very sophisticated tool for measuring fresh air in our sheds. And it took me a while as a young vet to realize this. It was underneath my eyes, my nose. You know, if we're going into our sheds and we're smelling that ammonia type smell, particularly in with stock, you know, we've got to look at, can we improve ventilation in our sheds? And, you know, a lot of our A-roof sheds, cattle produce heat and heat rises. And that's why we talk about outlets and inlets. So hot air rises, it needs an adequate outlet to escape from. And that creates a stack effect where cold air is pulled into the shed, recycling for air in our shed. So when you're seeing a lot of pneumonia during winter time in cattle, one of the first things I'll say at housing time is to really look at ventilation and look at inlets, outlets, look at the stocking density. So we've a lot of animals in our sheds, space becomes an issue. Yes, we can have an issue where we have too much airflow, and we talk about drafts, but I feel with our cattle producing so much heat through rumination that, you know, I often prefer to see sheds more open. And certainly people who have seen this mechanical ventilation or these tubes where they're driving air through a fan and through outlets, they can help in certain sheds as well. So one of the things that I would always do in sheds is just use smoke bombs. And I tend to try and get people to use them on the mildest day they can, because that'll really test what airflow is like. And it's very simple. You let off this. These are smoke bombs I use from a hardware store. I used to have the big, good pyrotechnic ones, but they're very hard to get. But you know, it just will tell you where airflow is going. So obviously, if you light your smoke bomb and the air blows it away too quickly, you might have an issue with drafts. But if it's lingering for, you know, over a minute or 2 minutes, we must look at ventilation as an issue and fresh air. It's a really important one. And again, these might seem like really simple things, but it's amazing after 20 years and all sorts of certs and dairy herd health and cow signals that I'm going back to the basics continually. And moisture and drainage is another one. So when we think about bugs and pathogens, particularly our bacteria, what do they like? They like damp, wet conditions, and our winters afford them that. Our silage diets often as well allow for maybe the fecal consistency that's ideal for bacterial growth. So just allowing to minimize moisture down is really important. And a really important point for me that I always go on to farm, and if we're looking at infectious disease, it's always about balancing two things. Really getting the most out of our immunity, that ability to fight infection, and reduce down infection pressure. That's the amount of bugs that an animal or an immune system is exposed to. So if we're looking at reducing down infection pressure in sheds, we're looking at moisture reduction, that leaking water troughs, making sure drainage is good. And you know, I work with a lot of dairy to beef units, and we look at different systems around maybe liebacks with, you know, feeding on slats, remembering that cattle, when they're tending to feed, they'll defecate and urinate more. So anything we can do to improve that environment will really help. So really looking at the fresh air, as I said before, and I'm a believer in more open sheds, because I think fresh air really dries out sheds. Now, it can be a challenge when we've cows and calves indoor, but I often find that we can make a creep area or a lieback area for calves that gets over that. And I think straw solves a lot of problems. Again, number 5 is a really simple one. You know, hygiene. We're all learning, unfortunately, the role of hygiene in the spread of disease. And particularly with loose housing, bedding is really important. And a very wise vet said to me many years ago here in Wicklow, he said, a lot of our problems can be solved on farm, Tommy, simply with more straw. It's a fantastic insulator. It keeps animals clean. Really, you know, so looking and focusing on simple things like that. Clipping tails is something that I would recommend a lot of our units do here. Clipping backs as well, maybe not from a hygiene perspective, but certainly with cattle sweating, especially when we're pushing on cattle a little bit more, just keeps everything a little bit cleaner and tidier. Again, the leaking water trough, you could be surprised how much damage that's doing in relation to moisture. And then when we look at hygiene, just the good use of the disinfectants. Look at maybe, you know, even from a biosecurity point of view, people coming onto your farm, having a working disinfection point. But any of our utensils we're using on farm, you know, make it easy to clean them. So if it's calf stomach tubes, maybe in springtime when you're calving, or the calf jack, I often will say just get a large blue barrel, cut it in half, have your disinfectant in it, make it easy, somewhere with a water pipe and a brush, and make it easy to keep things clean. It can make a huge difference. Now, Alison's going to talk about feed and the value of feed and feed conversion efficiency. And I think one of the steps before this is we talk about when we're feeding animals, again, back to that herd species, they'll stand together and feed, they'll lie together. So we need to look at feed space, and it becomes particularly important when we're feeding concentrates. Or maybe a lot of our farmers will, you know, have cows in good condition going into the winter and maybe want to restrict feeding. And so you would think if you're restricting feeding that you wouldn't have to worry about feed space. But that's actually when it becomes a real challenge, is that if we don't have enough feed space for animals, and particularly with restricted feeding, and we're watching body condition, the weaker animals in the bunch won't get up to feed, and they'll get bullied. And that's particularly important as well for heifers coming up to calving indoors. Just having that feed space right, and we can work out that based on, you know, the figures. Maybe might be some questions about that. The other thing about the feed space is actually the physical ease with which the cattle will put their head up and feed in the feed trough. And that can be, you know, the neck rail here, making sure that's at the right height. That, you know, again, with growing cattle, that it's not there. And you can, you know, one of the things I'll do in shed is I just use my nose, my eyes, my ears, listening for coughing, all these simple things. But I'll be checking cattle out and looking to see what pressure is on necks here. Does that neck rail, could that go up a little bit? Again, how high is this wall here at the feed face, that it's not pinching on neck? We can make it as easy as possible for cattle to get to feed space. Again, just a little bit about outwintering. We've good few farmers outwintering cattle. It can work quite well, particularly with a lot of our brassicas, and you know, just some of the things that I would see challenges. You know, particularly maybe with fluke might be a challenge. Ensuring that you've adequate forage out on the fields, particularly for feeding brassicas. Again, looking at maybe mineral supplementation if required. It can work well, but it requires a little bit of management. I suppose, why do we house cattle at all? Because of the adverse weather. So it can be a challenge where we get some severe winters, and I've seen some challenges, but it can work well when it's managed well. Just to get back onto, I suppose, the animal health side of it, winter can be a time for lameness. And if we think about the foot of cattle, extraordinary animals, you know, my children talk about how much daddy loves cows. And I really do. And I think about, you know, the foot of the cow, and this is looking from the bottom up, but it's an amazing structure. This soft sole here that grows probably takes, you know, 5 to 6 weeks to grow out from this tiny thin germinal layer. And then on the edges, we have this hard hoof structure. And when we get lameness in our cattle, you know, it can be very difficult to treat them. It can be very chronic, particularly when it's damage to that sole or surface. So if we can keep lameness under control, we can really get those cattle thriving. So we just need to think about the environment the foot's in. If it's infectious lameness, like martellaros affecting the back of the feet here, or fowls, just think about, again, that fresh air, you know, maybe running scrapers, just seeing what stocking densities are like. But something, and I spoke to John and Tom about this, about, you know, foot bats and using them, and they said your clients are using them. Copper sulfate formula. It doesn't have to be anything extravagant, but, you know, having the ability to maybe run cattle through the foot bat, and something I would certainly say before housing, and particularly if you're buying in maybe or overwintering stock, that, you know, you run them through the foot bat, just making it easy to use the foot bat. It's something to think about, because certainly when we have lameness issues on farm, they can really knock back performance. Typically with our in our beef systems, we don't see as much of it, but I have seen it, particularly when you get fowls or martellaro, these infectious lameness can be a real challenge. Okay, so just a little bit about liver fluke and parasites. So when we think about liver fluke, it's costing the UK agriculture industry about 145 million pounds has been estimated a year. So liver fluke is a real issue. And when we think about liver fluke, there's two risks in the life cycle. There's the risk outside the animal, and then there's the risk, obviously, when the fluke are inside doing damage to that liver. So when we think about the liver fluke cycle, our adult liver fluke produce eggs, which when they're in the right conditions will release these myricidia, which need this very important mud snail. And this is the intermediate host. So a lot of our issues with liver fluke tend to be in farms where we see larger populations of mud snail. So you'll know your own risk around liver fluke. So, you know, what can we do to reduce this risk? Well, typically you're going to see more activity with liver fluke from September, October onwards in risk farms. You know, should we be grazing wet areas? It can be quite difficult, but it is important to understand your risk on your farm. But then when we really think about the damage that liver fluke do, this is a liver that's been damaged by liver fluke, is chronic damage to this liver. And what happens in the fluke is when the cattle ingest these cercaria that's released from, when these cercaria are released from the mud snail, they go into the gut of cattle, and they have to cross across the gut, and they go in through the gut and they swim through the liver, and that takes about between 12 to 14 weeks. And that's important to remember, because during that phase, I call them the teenagers and the adolescents, these immature flukes do a lot of damage. And then eventually they develop into the bile ducts and gallbladder to become adult liver fluke, continuing the cycle again. And that's an important thing to remember, because when we talk about housing time, it's a huge opportunity to control liver fluke on our farms, control all parasites. but a lot of our liver fluke products will kill different stages of the cycle. So if we look at our common active ingredients, these will kill different stages of the cycle. So triclobendazole, and I know the lads have trickle alert cert there. It's triclobendazole will kill all stages. So you would think it'd be an obvious choice for a lot of farms. Unfortunately, we are seeing some resistance to triclobendazole, so it's something to bear in mind. Again, there's other products like closantel and natroxenol, Trodax being natroxenol, they'll kill fluke from 8 weeks onwards. So it's about understanding what the risk is on your farm and what product works best. And I think this is really when you talk to the guys and understand maybe what's the best choice for me. And then some of the products will do for both fluke and worm. And then we'll have products that will do for just adult flukes. And then you have a product also that contains this oxyclosanide, which will kill adult flukes and kill rumen fluke. Now, rumen fluke is a new on the scene parasite, but a lot of talk about this for the last 5 to 10 years. So I think each farm needs to make these decisions themselves, okay? When I think about liver fluke, what symptoms do we see in cattle? Some of you might have sheep as well. Because when we look at cattle, they have a larger liver, we tend to see more chronic wasting. With sheep, we can see acute disease, meaning we can find them dead. But with cattle, we tend to see chronic wasting. We can see scours. But we really have to understand, is fluke a risk in my farm? How do I find out? And I suppose people will traditionally understand and know that they have a risk on their farm through the history of the farm. Finding the mud snail, this is how small the mud snail is. He's a pretty small guy. So, I wouldn't go looking for mud snails, but there are things we can do. I would have always for years encouraged our farmers to go into the factories and try and get reports back now, which are automatically generated, to see what livers are like. Is there any fluke activity there? Because that gives us a great indication about fluke control in the farm. We can also do dung samples, but the challenge with dung samples, depending on the time of year, is we need adults to produce the eggs. So if we have a lot of these early immatures coming through and we get a negative dung sample for fluke, we can't say for certain that there isn't immatures there. So fluke can be complicated and it needs to be probably assessed on a farm by farm basis. And I'd love, one of the things, I worked for 16 months as the animal health specialist for our farming media company, the Irish Farmers Journal, and everyone wanted just a template that they could take onto their farms and they could dose with it. I think it's very farm specific. And one thing I will say, and I talked to a lot of people in research in both UK and Ireland, that we're seeing a lot more resistance to triclobendazole. So if we're using that triclobendazole that treats all stages of fluke and you're not getting the results you'd expect, if you're a mixed farm with sheep and cattle, just be mindful that resistance could be a challenge. Okay, I'm getting towards the end of my 10 topics, and this is a topic on its own, of course. It's worms, lice and mites. But it's very important, again, to think about worming as part of your winter control program, to break that cycle, to take out worms that might be affecting cattle internally, be it lungworm or Astratasia inside gutworms. And it's a great time as well to just get cattle, assess what weights are like and look at treatments. Fecal egg counts can be useful in first grazers, not so much useful in second grazers, and a little bit less reliable in older stock. So we need to look on our own farms and make decisions. Again, clipping cattle, I love clipping cattle right from the neck down to the rump, that maybe foot was 10 or 12 inches across the back. I think it really helps with sweating. I'd always do that and put on a lice treatment. So it's an important time to remember worms, lice and mites. Finally, I suppose the big one at housing is pneumonia. And nobody needs an introduction to our friend on the right-hand side there. A virus that's wreaked havoc across the globe. And we've all become sort of epidemiologists, understanding how disease spreads. And, as farmers and vets and advisors, we've kind of been aware of how viruses spread in our herds for a long time. But there's, it's easy to understand why we see more pneumonia at housing. Because cattle are closer together. We're changing their diet. We create stresses around the change of environment. Airflow becomes a challenge. So all of these things mean pneumonia is a bigger risk. Again, every farm should assess their own risk for pneumonia. Vaccination can certainly help or play a big role in that, but not unless we really tackle it around the environment the animals are in, stress factors that are there, and then using vaccines can make a difference. So pneumonia can be, again, quite a complicated problem, but if we can tackle it and understand, first of all, is it happening? And remember, with pneumonia in cattle, the lungs, when they're damaged, they don't heal. So if we get lung damage, we often think it's the antibiotic injections or the anti-inflammatory injections that we might be using to treat our cattle that are the cause of pneumonia. We forget that it's the damage done to one of the most important organs in the body, soaking oxygen into the blood, driving that metabolism and that performance in our stock. So it's a really big factor. So maybe we might have some questions on that as well. I've sort of covered, and I have this theory of being brilliant at basics, which I apply to not just veterinary, but life itself. And I think, you know, it might seem very simple what I presented there tonight, but I think if we focus on those simple things in the short term and maybe some long-term investments for, you know, focusing on comfort, they can really, really pay off. Improved animal performance and production will definitely occur from a focus on comfort and some of those simple things like even water and fresh air. So now that we have them comfortable, John, I'm going to hand over to Alison and yourself to get them fed. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Tommy. That was very informative. Alison will be on in just a second. Just to recap with everyone who's joined us a bit later on, we are all on mute, only because if we all speak at once, no one will get heard. You have the opportunity to ask questions. At the top of your screen, you should see a hand, and on the left-hand side of the hand is a little pop-out. You click that, and you can ask a question. I do have one question already for Tommy, which has come in, which is, should I be scraping out a scrape passage in my yards behind the feed fence twice a week?
So would you be scraping out your yard where at the feed face itself, or you're putting out the feed?
That's what I assume. Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah. So absolutely, because particularly, and I've seen it on a farm only during the week. They were trying to put out too much feed to save down on labour, and a lot of our silage was getting built up and pushed against the wall and fermenting and going off. So we're losing a lot of feed value there. So if you can keep that feed space as clean as possible and not allowing that build up, I think it makes a huge difference. So one thing I didn't talk about feed, particularly when you're pushing animals on, is actually ensuring feed is in front of them, pushing up that feed when required. But I think it's a really good practice to ensure that the feed is as fresh as possible. So that's putting it out regularly and keeping it clean, particularly where you have the wall meeting the feed barrier itself. We tend to get a lot of silage kind of pushed in there, and it tends to mold. And I'd be interested to hear Alison's opinion on that one as well. Great question.
So, Alison, I'm not sure if you're ready to rock and roll. If you are, then I'll just give you a quick introduction. Many of you know Alison already. You've seen her at a few R.M.Jones events when we talked about nutrition in the past. Alison has 14 years at Rumenco as their mainly or chief nutritionist. She is very involved in new products and innovating new ideas and new products for nutrition in livestock and ruminant livestock. So Alison's main interest, I think, in the background is calves and young stock in particular. She graduated from Nottingham University back in 2006, I think, did an MSc from Aberdeen University, and then had a PhD from Harper Adams in dairy cow nutrition. So I will hand over to Alison.
Wow. Thanks, John. That's a bit of an intro. So yeah, evening all, and thanks for joining us this evening. Just following on from Tommy's question before I start, there's some quite nice trial work that was done in dairy cows, I think, where they looked at the number of times they pushed up during the day, and the more you pushed up, the more those animals ate. So it just supports what Tommy was saying. But thanks, Tommy, for the great sort of presentation, leading us nicely in. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the feed sides of your diet. Over the winter feeding period, forages will form the basis of the ration, and rations themselves should be tailored according to the forages available and the type of animal that you're looking to feed. So I'm going to start this evening by looking in a bit more detail at what your forage analysis means from a nutrient point of view. We'll look at our forages this year, and then the importance of an analysis using this information to get the most from your forage. Finally, we'll touch on the use of supplementary feeds over this winter period for cattle. Well, in particular, we'll look at the Opti-Lix range of buckets to support forage use, animal performance, and then Superstock protein meals alongside your homegrown forages. So as we've already mentioned, forages will make up a large proportion of the winter diet for your cattle. As useful as average figures for the year are, nobody has an average silage, so I would definitely always recommend having a silage analysis undertaken to get that real view of what you have available on farm. Your diets can then be adjusted accordingly to ensure animals get the most from their diets cost effectively and achieve their targets. So the same diet every year doesn't always work. So when we analyse forages, we can undertake two types of analysis. Our first analysis would be a nutrient analysis. The picture you see here on the right shows our typical forage nutrient analysis and basically outlines the nutritional value of the forage from a dry matter, energy, protein point of view. So results will also give you some kind of idea of the fermentation and intake potential as well. So the nutritional quality of conserved forages can vary widely from season to season, year to year, field to field, and even from day to day, depending on when a forage has been taken. So analysis of your forage should be the starting point when looking at your diets for housing. This will make sure you can target different cuts and fields towards appropriate livestock groups depending on their requirements. And only once your analysis has been undertaken can you start to look at the supplementation required to complement that forage that you've got available. So definitely speak to your R.M.Jones rep if you're needing a forage analysis this winter. They'll be able to help sort it out and then advise you on your winter diets for housing. At Ramenco, we use an NIR or near infrared spectroscopy machine, which is more commonly used now rather than the wet chemistry of old. It scans your forage sample with infrared light and then makes predictions of the analysis. This is based on your known values and wavelengths that are already programmed into the machine. It's super quick, takes just a matter of seconds. So we can get these analyses turned around really quickly. Our second analysis that we can undertake is a mineral analysis. This gives us an idea of the minerals and trace element levels in your forage. This graph, similar to the previous slide, shows the average mineral forage report for first cut grass silages this year. I'd suggest that a mineral analysis is not as crucial as a nutrient forage analysis, but if cattle are not performing as expected and you're confident that you've got that energy and protein supply spot on, then I'd urge you to look at having a forage mineral analysis undertaken. It'll highlight any deficiencies or oversupplies. It'll highlight whether there's anything in that forage that might be locking up something else. And then your supplements and your diet can be formulated to meet your specific requirements. So this analysis, like I say, is an analysis for this year's first cuts, and you can see some down the bottom here, some quite high levels of copper antagonists, for example. This is probably due to the weather patterns we had, that very wet winter going into the spring, and then that very dry spell we had in April, May. These figures in particular would be quite important for your breeding cattle. A secondary copper deficiency as a result of copper lockup due to some of these heavy metals that we see high levels of here can affect fertility. The approximate cost of one of these forage analyses for your minerals is about £30, but again, depending on where you go to have that done. So a nutrient forage analysis can be a little bit mind-boggling, but I wanted to just spend the next couple of slides talking you through some of the important figures, especially when you're looking at those diets for winter housing and balancing to achieve growth targets. A lot of this is related to grass silage, but equally some of this information can be useful for whole crop silages and maize as well. So our first analysis is your dry matter. This is expressed usually as a percentage or grams per kilo. And it's the quantity of material remaining after all the water has been removed, usually by oven drying. So it's a measure of basically what is not water, and it has the greatest impact of any variable on the extent of fermentation. So too low, anything below maybe 25% dry matter, and fermentation can be prolonged. This results in high acids, excessive protein breakdown, and that can impact on dry matter intake and the availability of that forage. If it's too high, the forage may become unstable when you've got a really high forage. So dry matter is important. It also reflects the nutrients available to the animal, as water has no nutritional value. So our dry matter gives an indication of that diet that's available. And most of the rationing we do and the intakes we work on are all done on a dry matter basis. So that dry matter is really key. Our second value is our metabolizable energy, or ME. This is the estimated energy value of the forage available to the animal. It's a predicted figure, a calculated figure, and it's calculated from the digestibility of the forage. And it's expressed normally in megajoules per kilo of dry matter. So it's already in that dry matter. Then we've got your crude protein. This is calculated from the total nitrogen content of the forage and converted to crude protein through a simple equation, 6.25 times N. And it's a measure of the protein content of the forage. It can demonstrate how mature the grass was at the time of cutting. It doesn't give an indication of protein quality. In other words, that rumen degradability, which can have quite a significant effect on animal performance, but it is still a very useful figure. Ammonia nitrogen as a proportion of total nitrogen is formed by the breakdown of proteins during the ensiling process. So the extent of protein breakdown is dependent on the rate of pH decline in the silage. So as the acid environment of the silage eventually will reduce the activity of the enzymes that break proteins down. A high level of ammonia N in a silage, above say 10%, indicates a poor or extended fermentation, which has led to quite a lot of protein breakdown. So the quicker the rate of fermentation, the lower the ammonia N value. And we want a really quick fermentation. When we put that silage in the clamp or we bale it up, we want it to ferment really quickly to lower that, increase that acid level and do what we want it to do, pickling basically. So we want values below about 50 grams per kilo or 5%. This would indicate an excellent fermentation. Moving on to our D value, this is a measure of the feed digestibility. So the higher the D value of the forage, the more nutrients that are potentially available to the animal for production, maintenance and growth. So we were looking for a value of 60 and above, really. Anything below that indicates a poorer quality, maybe a later cut silage. So just because it's got a poor digestibility, it could be mixed well with a really high digestibility forage if you need to restrict intakes for maintenance. So it's not necessarily a bad silage. It's just worth understanding that digestibility value. So pH is a measure of the acidity of the silage, and in conjunction with that ammonia N value we looked at before, it's a key component in evaluating silage fermentation. So generally, the lower the pH, the better preserved and more stable the silage will be. However, if it gets really low, below, for example, 3.5, this can affect palatability. It can restrict how much an animal can eat, and it can cause acidosis in the rumen as well. So there's a fine line between hitting that good level of acidity that we've got a well-preserved forage and it being a little bit too low. Haylage, that tends to reach a final pH of around 4.5. And that's just because it's a drier product. Above this, it might indicate a poor or secondary fermentation, and it can risk deterioration in store, which is what we see often with high dry matter silages. Our volatile fatty acids, that's usually taking into account our acetic, propionic and butyric acids, but not lactic acid. They're all produced by microbes in the silage from sugars and other carbohydrate sources. So total VFA will generally increase with increasing moisture levels, and high VFA levels result from fermentations that convert greater amounts of rumen fermentable carbohydrate in our silage to rumen non-fermentable acids. This results in reduced energy and may present nutritional challenges such as limited intakes. So VFA is usually a reflection of the proportion of undesirable acids produced during fermentation. So we really want lower values. We want lower VFA values overall, and that would indicate a good fermentation and a good stability of silage. So we're looking for under 100 grams per kilo of VFAs. Lactic acid, on the other hand, is the principal fermentation acid that's produced during the ensiling process. So that results from a really good fermentation. So it's produced from lactic acid bacteria. It's the main driver for the initial drop in pH, and it's responsible for that pickling of the crop that we want to occur. So the faster that the fermentation proceeds, the less dry matter and energy loss, and the higher the lactic acid. So we want the lactic acid to comprise greater than 70% of our total VFAs. That indicates an efficient preservation. Lactic acid also useful for the rumen bugs as well. Tommy's mentioned that rumen vat of bugs that we're trying to feed. They can use that lactic acid as an energy source. So really, really important for them as well. And then finally, just quickly wanted to mention ash. So this is a measure of the total mineral content of the forage. but high levels above, say, 10%, that can indicate soil contamination that has occurred perhaps at harvest, and that can deteriorate silage. It can cause a poor fermentation. We often see higher ash levels. We see that soil contamination occurring when silage has perhaps been taken during dry weather and perhaps more soil's been more picked up. So moving on to look at some average figures for this year's silage, we'll focus on the beef and sheep column here. The first thing we can see is our higher dry matter here. This was above average for last year and is no real surprise, to be honest, when we think back to that weather we had around harvest, that April, May time, particularly high temperatures as well. But it's quite significant this year when we think about the less fresh weight that might be around. So clamps may look emptier, less bales on the floor, for example, but on a dry matter basis, there's actually more. So for example, a 600 kilo bale at 33% dry matter that we've got this year is equating to about 198 kilos dry matter compared to 175 kilos for last year's bale, which had 29% dry matter. Where's my mouse gone? Yes. So knowing and understanding our dry matter of our forage available should help with planning stocks and rationing. So this year we have some really good energy levels as well. This is encouraging and in general means silages should make an excellent winter ration base for those growing stock, autumn calving sucklers and pregnant ewes. For spring sucklers, it could be a little bit too pokey. It could be too much rocket fuel there, but could be diluted with our later, maybe lower energy cuts and perhaps fed alongside a lower energy feed such as straw to avoid gaining too much condition. But again, make sure you have it analysed and get a good picture of what's going on. It's a similar story for protein as well, which again, those levels are up on last year. Fibre, which is here as neutral detergent fibre, this is slightly lower this year, but it shouldn't be an issue, and it might in fact improve the silage intake potential as well alongside that higher dry matter. And then the final one I wanted to mention here is the SIP. This is a figure that's obtained from our NIR analysis, and it gives an estimate of the likely voluntary intake of the silage. So 90 would indicate an average silage. So we've got a good high SIP value. The higher value this year combined with our higher ME that we've just mentioned could support gains of between 0.8 and 1 kilo per day. A lower SIP value will indicate poorer silage and may only support maintenance. So just emphasising the importance of having your silages analysed. As we've already mentioned, no farm has the average silage, and so it is really important to know what you've got there. Let's look at an example here to demonstrate further the importance of having your silage analysed this winter. So we've got 3 silages here, a good, an average and a poor based on their ME. We can look at this data in a number of ways. Firstly, the difference between your 11 and your 9.5, it's just 1.5 megajoules, not a lot, I hear you say, but it could be the difference between 144 days to finish and 230 days to finish as a result of that lower growth rate for those animals that were fed the 9.5 ME. Alternatively, if you're targeting a certain growth rate over the winter, say 0.65 daily live weight gain, your animals being fed the 10.5 ME need just 1 kilo of barley to hit their target, whilst those animals on the 9.5, just 1 megajoule difference in that silage, they're going to need 3 kilos of barley per animal today. With cereal prices being that bit higher this year, and this therefore affecting the cost of hard feed, I'd suggest that this year, more so than ever, it'd be important to know what you've got there. So don't assume the same ration fed last year will work this year. We can undertake a similar exercise for the suckler cows as well. Spring calving suckler cows will have a requirement over the winter of around 80 megajoules per day. This assumes that they don't need to lose or gain any condition. If we take a 25% dry matter forage, this suckler will require 35.5 kilos of forage to fulfill that energy requirement. If the forage is a higher energy, say 11.5 ME, then the requirement is around 8 kilos less. So that difference could mean that animals will put an extra 0.5 kilo on per day, which if they need to is fine, but if they're already being housed in good condition, then this gain could be bad for them and result in issues around calving. So if you know what you've got on farm, you can manage to restrict that intake. You can add a bit more straw to the diet. You can buffer that really good quality silage that you've got. So I think it'd be fair to say that from a feeding point of view, our objective at housing is going to be to optimise the contribution from forage. And this is particularly important this year, like I said, with the costs of cereals and hard feeds creeping up. And so to be able to do this, we need to start with a nutrient forage analysis. We know the full potential then we need to optimise forage intake and then complement with the correct type and quality of supplement for what we're trying to achieve. So what do we mean when we say supplements? A supplementary feed, as its name suggests, is a feed offered, often free access, alongside the diet, which 9 times out of 10 is forage or grazing based. Supplementary feeds would include feed and mineral blocks and buckets, liquid feeds and minerals in any form. They supplement the diet to help correct nutritional deficiencies in grazing and forage crops, and they can be used to provide extra nutrients at key times in the production calendar, such as tupping. The important fact is that they are supplementing your forages rather than actually replacing the forage intake at all. So we know that feeding homegrown forages and grass is the cheapest way to produce milk and meat. However, there will be certain times of year and certain times of the production cycle when it doesn't always supply enough nutrients, and this includes energy, protein, minerals, vitamins and trace elements. So by offering supplementary feeds, this can help us make good these deficiencies in forages, as well as supplying those extra nutrients at key times, such as winter housing. So supplements can also be used to help solve and prevent problems such as mag deficiency, such as key times in the spring and autumn grass flush. They can be used to manipulate grazing. We talked a little bit about outwintering. So this can be important when grazing might be a little bit poor, encourages animals to better graze and otherwise a poor area. GPS work has shown that animals tend to graze further when there's a supplement out as well. The extra addition of minerals, vitamins and trace elements, along with energy and protein in certain products, will help to improve health, fertility, production and overall animal appearance, whilst offering supplementary feeds is quite easy and time-saving option on farm, with supplements being left out 24 hours a day and lasting a number of days as well. Opti-Lix in particular is a dehydrated molasses low moisture bucket. So this means that during its manufacture, molasses is heated to a really high temperature for a short period. This drives off all the moisture. This quick process ensures that all sugar is preserved, and therefore we have a really high consistent sugar product. The dehydrated molasses then has all the extra ingredients added that we look for in that bucket, so extra energy and protein and minerals and vitamins. And the product is then discharged into buckets and left to cool and cure naturally over 24 to 48 hours. So during that time, that bucket will harden, and the final product actually has a dry matter value of around 97% and is really, really hard. It's hygroscopic. So what this means is that it draws in water and moisture. And so therefore, once the lid is removed, ready for feeding, it will take moisture from the environment as well as from an animal's muzzle, and this will soften that top layer of the bucket, enabling it to be eaten. But it also helps to regulate intakes as well. So there's a number of products in the Opti-Lix range to cover most systems and help supplement and optimize forage intakes. And we're going to look in a little bit more detail at the cattle balancer and the Pre-Calver now. So the Opti-Lix cattle balancer is a high energy and protein lick. It contains 14% protein, and that is a mix of natural and urea protein sources. So that really helps promote growth and production, but it also supports rumen and digestibility of poorer quality forages. Lots of really nice data on the benefits of urea protein for cattle and how they can turn that into a really good quality protein, but also it feeds the rumen bugs and it improves digestibility of those poorer quality forages as well. Contains a nice high energy level as well, 12 ME. So this is really good for helping to maintain body condition and again support forage digestibility and the use of forages in general, and a really nice high sugar as well, which helps keep those bugs happy. So this little and often intake that we see with these types of supplements is really nice for rumen stability. It helps keep that rumen pH at a nice level. We don't get the peaks and troughs that you often see with lots of concentrate feeding. And this will help drive that forage intake and digestibility because the rumen bugs are happier, they're working harder, and every mouthful of food, the animal's going to get more from it. So Cattle Balancer also contains a full specification of minerals, vitamins and trace elements. It includes 3% phosphorus, which plays a really important role in growing cattle and fertility in breeding animals. It contains multiple copper sources. So copper is important for enzyme activity, immune function, and it is directly involved in fertility. There was some recent work undertaken at Nottingham University that demonstrated that although a lot of dairy cows were bordering on copper toxicity levels, beef animals were really quite low in copper. And so the addition of multiple copper sources helps to prevent copper deficiency as a result of copper lockup, which can occur when high levels of antagonists such as molybdenum and iron are fed. So we saw that this year's silages have got quite high levels of those antagonists within. And then finally, our Opti-Lix cattle balancer also contains a good level of zinc. So this includes a proportion of protected zinc as well, which is a source of zinc that's protected from the rumen bugs and therefore highly available to the animal. So zinc plays a really important role in tissue health with high levels in skin, wool, hair and horn. Levels in forage are often quite low, so supplementation is important. And in good levels, including the protected source, will help support animal health and tissue health, therefore reducing risk of issues such as lameness and improving udder health in those breeding animals as well. So Opti-Lix cattle balancer is pretty much suitable for all cattle requiring that little bit extra energy and protein. It's ideal for feeding indoors and outside when that extra performance is required to help reach target weights for bulling or for sale. It's not suitable for mixed grazing situations. The copper levels in there are not suitable for sheep, and it's not suitable for cattle under 3 months of age due to the urea protein in there. However, it is suitable for beef and dairy cows during lactation and at bulling time, outwintered cattle, housed cattle on forage-based rations. So we'd recommend, as with a lot of these supplements, positioning one 20-kilo bucket for every 15 cattle or one of the big 80-kilo tubs for 50 head of cattle. Typical intakes are around 300 grams per head per day, but this will depend on the stage of production of the animals, the age of the animals, and more importantly, the forage quality and quantity that's available. A typical example using the Opti-Lix cattle balancer may look something like this. If we've got some growing cattle, we're looking for steady, continuous growth on these animals. We want to develop lean frames. So diets should contain up to about 16% protein. Depending on the breed, energy is not so key here. A medium to energy density diet would work around 11.5 or below. So the total diet, we're looking at gains of around 0.7 to 1 kilo per day. So this diet here is fully mineralized, so no extra supplementation is required. We've got a couple of kilos of cereal in there. We've got 300 grams of the Opti-Lix cattle balancer, and then we've got ad lib, silage and haylage. And depending on that quality of that silage and haylage, you mess a bit with the cereal in there. But like I say, no extra supplementation required on top of that bucket. So I wanted to quickly mention one more Opti-Lix cattle product this evening, and that's the Pre-Calver. I know we're a little bit of a way off spring calving, but it's worth thinking ahead. So this product contains a full specification of mins, vits and trace elements again, but they've been specifically formulated for the dry cow. So it contains a low calcium and high magnesium mix, which helps muscle tone and calving ease. But the lower calcium as calving approaches will also encourage animals to start to mobilize calcium from their stores prior to the start of higher requirement at milking post-calving. So this is going to help to minimise the risk of milk fever. It gets that animal ready. It doesn't contain extra protein, so it's not going to affect calf size, but the high levels of sugar due to the Opti-Lix manufacturing process will help to support rumen health and forage digestibility, again making sure animals get the most from their diet. The Pre-Calver contains good levels of the natural antioxidants, vitamin E and selenium. These are very important for calf vigour and health, meaning calves are born and up and suckling quickly. The vitamin E is not easily passed through the placenta, so it's important cows are offered a good diet of vitamin E so that colostrum, that all important first drink, contains the vitamin E. Selenium, on the other hand, is passed through the placenta, but equally as important for mum to make sure that calf is born with a good selenium level. It also contains the multiple copper sources, and including a protected source, and high levels of zinc, again including a protected source to support hoof and udder health. And finally, the addition of niacin or vitamin B3 helps control the release of those non-esterified fatty acids into the blood. This reduces the risk of ketosis, which can be a problem in cows with high body condition scores as they approach calving. So we'd recommend feeding the Opti-Lix pre-calver from about 6 weeks pre-calving. And as with the cattle balancer, 1 bucket per 15 head of cattle, or one of the bigger tubs per 50 cattle. Intakes will be up to about 250 grams per head per day. But again, this is very much dependent on the forage quality and availability and size and age of the cattle. So we've seen that depending on forage quality, our spring calving cows will probably need very little supplementation this winter, but our autumn calvers with calves at foot and our growing and finishing cattle may need some extra supplementation, and this might be in the form of cereals. The high rainfall we had earlier in the season, followed by our drought, means that cereal quality has not been so good this year, and it didn't make milling grade, a lot of it. So as a result, there's perhaps a bit more on farm to feed. So cereals are an excellent energy source. They contain starch, protein, starch energy, which is really key to finishing animals. Protein can be a little bit variable depending on the type of cereal and quality. Cereals have quite good levels of phosphorus in them. That's quite an expensive element to put into the diet. So if we can provide it elsewhere, then that's always a bonus. And they will require processing or cracking if it's being fed to cattle to ensure they can get the most from them. The Superstock range of proteins offers quite a nice protein source to combine with your homegrown cereals this winter to make a complete feed. And with the price of soya sneaking up, then some of these can be a really cost-effective solution. All the blends contain a full specification of minerals, vitamins and trace elements. So your Supreme beef, for example, is a 40% protein. It's all natural protein, so it's all blends of rapes and soya in there, and it's got quite a nice energy level in there as well. Whilst your high pro beefs, they are a mix of urea protein and natural protein. And so we've got a 50% and a 60%. So you've got all the advantages of home mixing. It's easy and accurate mixing, offering that flexible ration formulation, which means you can tweak rations according to what you're trying to achieve, whether you've got growing animals or finishing animals, and then providing all those minerals and vitamins as well. The products are lightly molassed, so this helps to lay the dust. It minimises sorting as well, and it ensures palatability. So the addition of just one of your 25 kilo bags will add, depending on the product you choose, between 1 and 1.5% protein to your final mix. So an example diet might look a little bit like this. We've got 10% of the high pro beef in there. That's the 50% protein. So 10% would be about 4 bags per tonne. And the rest is just made up from a wheat and oat mix. You've got a fully mineralized mix there of 14% and an ME of 12.8. So it's spot on for those finishing cattle that really need that high energy to push them on. And you've got a nice dust-free and molassed feed. So to summarise, from a nutritional point of view this winter, we need to optimise our forage intake at housing, whatever the system. To achieve this, a forage analysis is essential to understand the quality of the feed available and the supplementation required to ensure animals reach their targets, whether that be for breeding or sale. So average forage analysis for this year would suggest good quality forages are available with higher dry matter as a result of the dry April and May. Energy is also higher along with protein, and this is great news in a year when hard feeds and compounds are on the increase in price. So understanding your forage available will allow rations to be formulated accordingly. Supplementation in the form of molasse buckets, such as Opti-Lix, is an excellent way of providing essential minerals, vitamins and trace elements this winter. Opti-Lix in particular is a dehydrated molasse low moisture supplement that provides consistent intakes over a number of formulations. This makes it suitable for indoor feeding as well as outside at grass, and that little and often feeding of supplements also supports forage intake and digestibility, helping those animals get the most from their forage. Cattle Balancer and Pre-Calver in particular both contain a full specification of minerals. They've been formulated according to requirements, but they also contain multiple copper sources, protected zinc, which will play an important role in animal health and production this winter. For those animals that maybe need a little bit extra energy and protein, a home mixed meal containing homegrown cereal and a protein meal offers many advantages, including the flexibility of balancing according to requirements, making use of homegrown feeds rather than selling and buying in compound. So my take home message, really, get your forages analysed. I know I've mentioned it a lot tonight, but it is really key to understand what you've got on farm, and then you can adjust your diets accordingly and then consider some kind of supplementation to help get the most from your forages and reach your targets on farm. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us this evening. Please fire away with any questions.
Thank you, Alison, for that. That was, as ever, very informative, very useful. And I think there's a bit of echo there. Yeah, thank you for that. That's been very useful, Alison. I do have a few questions that have come in. One of them was, someone has asked, when it comes to the whole ration, if you're talking about growing cattle at sort of 15-16% protein levels, is that the whole ration needs to be at that 15-16%, or is that the concentrate element needs to be that?
Really, the whole diet. You're looking at having a whole ration at that sort of level.
So that's grass, that's silage, as well as
that's everything.
Proteins in there.
But
Okay.
it depends very much on the breed of cattle and actually what you're trying to achieve as well.
Tommy, there's a question coming from yourself, which is, my yards are open-sided and very breezy, and the rain does blow in there, but it's obviously very well ventilated. Should they be concerned of cow conditions in those sort of yards, or is that openness, but a little bit of rain it's gonna be fine for their livestock?
It's a good question. So I think we got obsessed for years of building enclosed sheds for cattle. So I have done a bit of traveling and looking at cattle in different systems. And, you know, if winters are favourable, how well cattle do outside during the winter if we don't have adverse weather. So I have certainly gone back to more open sheds when animals have a rumen and they're really, you know, they're like, so calves can be different, but when it's adult or growing cattle, they do well in open sheds. Now, unless they're very, very exposed, which I've seen very little of, I find myself going onto farm, opening up sheds all the time, taking off sheets, maybe putting up Yorkshire boarding, but generally I would find open sheds quite good. Now, unless, I mean, some of the metrics we always will check is, you know, looking at the cattle themselves, how comfortable do they look? Are we seeing issues with pneumonia or issues with cattle being stressed after adverse weather events? But I just don't see it, and I'm moving back towards that, you know, that roof over roof over an animal and open sheds for the adult animals. So that would be my own personal opinion from kind of looking at it for a number of years, John. Great question.
Okay. Someone else has asked, which is very pertinent this year, is what alternatives are there to straw as a bedding material? Straw is expensive. It's in short supply this year, and I know people are looking a bit nervously for next spring.
So I suppose I can take it from my perspective. We've seen shortages in straw over the last couple of years, and we have certainly recommended peat bedding as an option because it works quite well. It works well from a perspective of a cow comfort once it goes in fresh and the drainage underneath is not an issue. Now, we have a whole different debate occurring around peat availability because of its ability to sink carbon in the environmental story. So very much we've moved away from it. But, you know, I often say, you know, if there's no alternatives and peat is available, it's something to consider. In adult cattle, then you're looking at your wood chip or something like that. They tend to get very damp and messy. So they'd be my two experiences. I don't have huge other options around it. I still even think when straw, it's dear, looking at what you can do to maybe help with drainage. And sometimes, and this is a little bit off the wall, but I've seen the like of probiotics being used in sprays. And look, this is just something I've seen, sprayed onto straws, straw bedding, and it keeps it drier for longer. So I think even though straw is dear, it's still hard to beat, John.
I've heard of people using miscanthus in Ireland as bedding material. Is that a growing? Are people growing it themselves very much over there?
Miscanthus was grown as a crop, as an energy crop. There was grants for it. I haven't seen it myself used as bedding. So I've seen wood chip, I've seen sawdust, I've seen different things. But typically, it's wood chip, peat or straw. We will typically see in loose housing. Wood chip works okay. It can get very dirty and very messy if drainage and you don't have enough drainage underneath it. But I haven't seen miscanthus bedding used too often, and we don't have a huge amount of it. Whatever grants were available, I think they're gone again. But it was grown as an energy crop, so that's probably why we saw a bit of a surge over the last couple of years.
Okay, I've got another question for Alison. We've only got time for a couple more questions, but another question for Alison, which is, are you seeing more problems with bull fertility, and have you got any suggestions or recommendations on how to ensure your bulls stay fertile?
I think we are seeing more issues with fertility in general. I think you need to balance that energy. That's important, but I think we need to be looking a little bit more at minerals and vitamins as well. Especially with our maybe our sucklers, we do neglect them a little bit, and I think it is worth having a bit of an understanding of what's going on there, especially from that copper point of view. We're seeing molybdenum go up quite considerably over the last number of years in our forages, and that will have a significant effect on locking up that copper. So from that point of view, we are seeing, you know, increased issues. But I think overall, this year I've had quite a few people phone up and ask me about just generally issues with fertility and breeding and calving, and so I think we're in for a bit of a year, probably due to the season we've had in terms of forages. Perhaps animals being a little bit over conditioned. Although we had a drought, they did tend to put a bit more condition on back end when that rain came. The grass came. We've still got quite a bit of grass now. So yeah, I think we are seeing more issues with fertility.
And I think this must be the last question, because the time's, we're getting on for nearly 8:30. Someone's commented, do additives make a difference to silage quality in good growing conditions, in good harvesting conditions? I suppose that's for Alison more than anyone.
Question. I'm no expert really on additives. You guys might be able to comment better. I think the key is that they can drive a faster preservation, so you perhaps get a more stable forage available to you. I don't think they necessarily increase the nutritive value, but they would give you a more stable preservation. I suppose, I don't know, Tommy, are you at all familiar with?
I had a conversation. I have lots of conversations. I had a conversation about this today with somebody who is. I said I was interested in the microbiome, so I know a friend of mine who's in that space, and he was talking about the use of bacteria, particularly the lactobacillus bacteria in silage. Now, I'd never heard of this before, to maybe improve the fermentation process. We have lots of products in the marketplace. I probably yet to see something that's going to maybe improve on the time we cut it and actually watching and the weather, getting the right weather. But I'd say there's small marginal gains from my experience, very, very small.
So maybe in tougher conditions, there may be more of a use for them than there might be in best quality conditions. You might be able to save you money a little bit as long as you make the good silage. I don't think there's much time for any more questions, I'm afraid, this evening. I hope everyone's enjoyed this evening. We've had 2 great talks from 2 great speakers. I'm going to buy Tommy a virtual beer and Alison a virtual beer now at the virtual bar, and I hope they enjoy it. As I said earlier, if there are any other talks or topics you would like discussed, or if you've got any thoughts on timings for these sort of meetings, whether you want lunchtime meetings or evening meetings, please let us know. Please let Carwyn, Jack, Andrew, or any of the farm centres know what sort of times would suit you. And if you do have forage samples or you do want some taken, please let us know. Obviously, social distancing considered, we will come out on farm, take silage samples, send them off. They're all free, and they, as Alison said, they are crucial to know what you're feeding to your livestock and how to get the best out to them. Or alternatively, if you want, just bring them into any of the farm centres anytime that you want to. So I think on the back of that, I'd like to say good night to everyone. Thank you all for coming, and good night to everyone.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the R.M.Jones team and Alison and Romenko for having me along, and stay safe. We're on opposite sides of the water, but we face the same challenges, so stay safe, and hopefully everyone has a happy Christmas. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Tommy. Thanks, John.
Thank you.